Well, good morning and welcome to all of you. I'm Judy Durzo, co-founder along with Helga Shimkat of the Animal Law Section and past chair. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mary Lane Leslie, who is a trust and estates attorney, has been forever, right?
37 years almost.
Yeah. So she just got started.
That sounds long, long, long.
She's also the founder of Watch Over Our Friends, or WOOF, the greatest acronym in the world, that she's going to tell you all about. And WOOF acts as a trustee for pet trusts, and Mary Lane is the expert in the state on pet trusts. So
I wouldn't go that
Mary
far.
Lane.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for coming out on a Monday morning. Nice to see you all here. Yeah, let me give you a couple of disclaimers first. I'm not sure I'm the expert on pet trust in New Mexico. I relied heavily on the work of Professor Jerry Beyer, who is at Texas Tech School of Law, which happens to be my alma mater. He and I did graduate from law school the same year, so we weren't classmates. But he truly is, there's probably two experts in the country on pet trust. And I sort of stumbled into it and then stumbled into him, and he's been a wonderful mentor and helped me a lot. I think what I have that perhaps Professor Beyer doesn't have yet is I have practical experience in running a pet trust. And I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. But how many of you here are members of the Animal Law Section? Okay. And other sections, estate? Okay, well, thanks for coming. So I did this a couple of years ago, and I want to thank Judy and Guy Dissery for inviting me today. We started setting this up. We set it up first in November, and then there was a death in my family, and then we set it again for earlier in March, and then we set it again for today. And ironically, in that time frame, the pet trust statute that was under intestate succession was repealed by the New Mexico legislature. But we do have another one, and we'll look at that pet trust. We have what's called the Statutory Pet Trust, which is in the trust section. It's 46A 4408, and there's a copy of it in your materials. So, and there's a copy of the other one with the lines struck through all of the lines showing that as of July 1st, 2016, the other statute that I had been using is repealed. But I don't think it makes much of a difference. So, yeah, Judy alluded to the fact I've been practicing since November of 1979. I went to Texas Tech. In October of 1996, my husband and I moved to Taos, and we have never looked back. And animals were a huge part of my life there. They've always been a huge part of my life. My dad was one that brought home baby rabbits and things like that. But in the course of my practice, there's so many people in Taos that do not have family in the area. And one of the questions I was asked over and over again was, can you help me, do something about my animals that will survive me? And so this grew out of that. And I formed Watch Over Our Friends, and I cannot take credit for the name. I do love the name, but one of my board members and best friends, also an animal nut, came up with it, and of course the acronym is WOOF. So we founded that. I founded that with a friend of mine who had gone to work for me after we sold her pet store. She had a tack and pet supply store. And then, most unexpectedly, she lost a son to a medical error, and then she herself died at Mayo Clinic over in Scottsdale waiting for a liver transplant. So that's where I have the practical experience. I have 5 of her animals that we are caring for, and I've learned a great deal about what you should and shouldn't do in a pet trust from running that particular trust. My own practice is really mom and pop wills and trust. I don't do tax work. I have no desire to know anything about the IRS code, and I have people who help me with that. One of the things that I have learned from Professor Beyer just recently is that there can be tax consequences to pet trust. And so it's one of the things that we're going to look at today. And fortunately, I have a solution for you to keep it from being taxable. And that happens to be watch over our friends, which was not the intent when I founded that. All right, so with that said, let me start. The presentation, I said don't bark up the wrong tree because you probably ought to use the trust statute now and forget about the one that's going to be repealed on July 1st. And yes, I want to definitely thank Professor Beyer. He is the Governor Preston E. Smith Regents Professor of Law at Texas Tech University. He's presented pet law things all over the U.S., and part of the presentation that I'm using today is from his research paper called Fido with a Fortune, which is on his website, which is also noted in your materials, and from his presentation in 2013 to the State Bar of New York. So this is taken from his presentation. So I'm sure you guys are probably aware of this. It's a little astonishing when you see the numbers, and of course people spend billions on animals these days in our society. I think I was talking to a woman in Taos who ran the CASA program there, the Child Advocate program, and she said, I can't get people to volunteer for me, and I'm sort of embarrassed because lots of people want to help animals. So you all know the potential benefits of pet ownership. Everybody here have a pet? Not a pet, okay. You're missing something very dear. Anyway, and I can fix you up. But yeah, these are all scientifically proven that, you know, owning pets, whether it's a cat or a dog or a horse or reptiles even, birds, they make such a difference. And I will try to stay on track, but I can think of a million stories to tell you, including about a nursing home that reduced its medical bills for its residents by 35% by bringing in dogs, cats, and birds into every room in the nursing home. That's in a book called Being Mortal, which is probably those of you who are in estate planning are familiar with, by Atul Gawande. Great book. Anyway, so here's 79% of us sleep with pets. I myself slept with Judith's dog Diesel last night. I love the next one. 70% would rather be stranded on a desert island with their pet than their spouse. You know that joke, I got a dog for my husband. My friend said it was a good trade. I didn't mean to be sexist here. 68% dress up pets for the holidays. I've done that. All right, so do you all know the story of Leona Helmsley? You know, she left millions to her dog Trouble, her little, I think it was a little Bichon Frise, and she left, I think, $10 million to him and not a dime to her grandkids. Well, those ungrateful grandkids sued, and Trouble was left with just $2 million. Dusty Springfield, I believe, left her entire estate to care for her cat. And Doris Duke, known for her love of dogs. And I believe she was the benefactress of the canine research program at Duke University, I think. I'm not positive. So this is an underserved area of estate planning. You know, a lot of people don't even know to ask if there's a way to do it. They have talked to their neighbors. They've asked family, you know, will you take my dog? Will you care for it? Well, of course they will, but circumstances change, and that's why it's good to really put things into writing and in pretty specific directions. You don't have to be real specific, but the client needs to be specific, and it needs to be reviewed pretty often. I recommend you put kind of flexible language in the documents, and I think that it is as important to put them in powers of attorney as it is to put it in a will and a trust, because we've all read the stories in the paper about, you know, some person who lived alone, had lots of animals. Nobody found them when they died for 3 or 4 days, and their animals were just there. You need to have emergency care provisions set up for your clients' animals. That is, to me, that is really more important than having the long-term care set up. And of course, the vast majority of people we know don't have wills. I think there's that suspicion, if I do my estate planning, I'm going to die. I haven't had that happen very often, unless someone was already terminal when they came to me for a will. The planning is often inadequate. I have a friend who actually, we have fundraisers from time to time for Watch Over Our Friends because we don't use any of the money from a trust to run the operation. There's not much operational expense to running it, but he will donate a pet trust, but his pet trust is like, I leave $10,000 to Diesel, period. And then he thinks that the other things can be set up later. I'm trying to convert him, but all right. So here is the short-term care planning I'm talking about that's important. And there is, in your packet, there are copies of forms that I got from the Adult Protective Service here in Albuquerque. One of the elder care people, one of the elder care social workers, a woman named Sherry Paperno, gave me these forms, and they're excellent. And these are a version of them. These are not those forms, but they are a version of them. These wallet alert cards, this particular one you can see came from the Humane Society. So you can download those. I can send them to you. I do want to tell you, and I'm glad that there's some of you here today, that I can make you, I've got a business card here that has a built-in flash drive, and I can put all of this presentation material on this flash drive. And I just picked them up last night, so I don't have them ready yet, but I could even do them very rapidly for you before you leave today. Or I will be happy to send you one, so either way you want to do it. So the wallet alert card, if you're in a car wreck, you're unconscious, your dog's in the car, or not in the car. I worry about that. I won't let my house sitter leave my house until we are in our driveway because I'm so afraid we'll be killed between the Taos Plaza and the Gorge Bridge, which could certainly happen. Here's the wallet card for emergency personnel. This is, I guess, the back side of it. This is what I say that the client should keep and should update regularly. They need detailed information. They actually need to put down a log of how do you care for your animal on a daily basis. Is your animal used to having a walk first thing in the morning? That needs to go in that notebook. Is the animal used to having kibble with wet food on it? All of the little details that all of us that have too many animals in our lives spend hours and hours doing for them. And you want it to be easy for your caregiver to find. I always prepare a binder for my clients with their estate planning documents in it, whether it's the powers of attorney and a will, or whether it's a trust, or whether it's a combination of all of the above, a pour-over will, and put it all together, and you let the people near you, and near and dear to you, and especially a neighbor, know where that book is, so that it's pretty innocuous, doesn't even have to have a label on it, but they should be able to know to look for the white binder that's sitting on the shelf next to my coffee pot, or whatever you do. Yeah, keeping it near the dog food, I don't even do that. And including all of the information and documents, your not only your own information, your life insurance, your car title copy, all of that kind of stuff, but your vet, who takes care of your animals, who's used to your animals, who can approach them. I couldn't find it, again, after I came across it on the internet, and I thought it was on Professor Byer's website, but there was this heartbreaking story, written from a dog's point of view about, I went out for a walk this morning with my owner, and we had such a good time, and then she went off to work, but here it is, dark. She should have been home. She's not here. Now it's the next morning. Where is she? oh my God, here come strange people. What are they doing here? I'm going to bite them. You know, the dog gets put down. So we definitely want to prevent that kind of thing from happening, because animals are very routine critters, and they very much want to be able to know who's going to be coming in that door and taking care of them. So this is where you really help your clients with that sort of planning. This door sign, again, this is from the Humane Society. I actually have not this one, but another one that our fire department gives us in Taos on my front door. And then the durable power of attorney. This is the short-term care. You know, it can just go in the special instructions just to say, I authorize my best friend, Judy, to come in here and to take possession of my animals in an emergency if I'm incapacitated temporarily or permanently. And I also authorize her to have so much money from whoever your financial agent is. I authorize her to be reimbursed for expenses or whatever. Now, to place the pet with a caregiver and to pay the caregiver's expenses and or a fee. If you pay the caregiver a fee, that's where a possible taxable consequence comes in. You want to make your directions specific that what you are doing is reimbursing the caretaker, and if you include a fee, you know, and I think if you keep it nominal, maybe you won't have the tax things. I'm not going to go there because I'm not a tax attorney, as I told you. I would like to have Professor Beyer come here and give us a seminar about the tax consequences, and he would be delighted to do that. All right, so here's then the long-term overview. Statutory Pet Trust. In your packet is the Statutory Pet Trust, the 46A 4408. The copy of it is in there. And it is, you know, it's very cut and dried. It says, well, I have a copy of it on the laptop, but I'm not sure how to get to it. It basically says you can set up a pet trust. You can leave money in it. You can authorize someone to enforce it. You can even authorize, there is a another person interested in the welfare of the animal may petition the court to enforce it. It's not a shall. And one of the things that Professor Beyer and I both think is very, very important is you should not name the trustee and the caregiver to be the same person, because there is that potential of, what is it about human nature that, you know, there's just temptation involved. If you leave $10,000 to take care of your 3 animals and the person taking care of them has a medical emergency or, you know, a child that wants to go to soccer camp, they're like, oh, there's, you know, I could just borrow from the pet trust. Who's going to know? Well, exactly. Who's going to know unless the trustee of those funds is not the same person as the caregiver? So I think that it is really best if you have 2 different people doing that. And if you name Watch Over Our Friends as your trustee, we are non-taxable. It's a, you know, we're a 501c3, and we have that fiduciary responsibility, and we're going to make sure the funds are spent only for your client's animal. So then we have, you can do just a traditional trust and make a beneficiary the recipient of the trust funds. You can't leave the money, of course, directly to the animal. Animals are personal property. They are, and that hasn't changed since Roman times, literally. They were determined to be personal property back under Roman law, and there's never been an upgrade to that position for animals. There are a lot of animal advocates trying to do that, to get animals, you know, especially chimpanzees, gorillas, other things that are genetically close to us, recognized as sentient beings. And I think once that happens, probably, you know, dogs, cats, even reptiles will be found to be deserving of care that is humane and kind. So you can do, you know, the inter vivos or testamentary trust is really the one that bridges everything, of course, just like a trust for a human being. You can specify in there all of the things that you would put in the power of attorney, too. The short-term things that happen if someone is incapacitated temporarily, long-term if the incapacity is going to last until their death, and then, of course, what happens at the time of death. It is more expensive to set up, and it does require more maintenance, of course. You've got to, the trustee, you have to fund it immediately in some way. And I'm an advocate of funding it with funds that are enough to take care of short-term care, but until there is need for the animal to be transferred to the new pet guardian permanently, you don't want to fund it with a big amount. For one thing, what if the person doesn't have an animal when they pass away? You want to make sure that your provision is in there for who takes the trust fund money if there is not an animal to survive the person. One of the things that I see in our pet trust statute is that it does say that the trust terminates at the pet's death, and if there's more than one animal, at the end of life of the last of the animals to survive. So that's, that's helpful, but it's not, in my opinion, it's not complete enough, because it's sort of, what Professor Beyer and I were discussing is that it limits the discussion of what animal is covered by the trust to the animals you own at the time, or the person owns at the time you create the trust. I put language in there that says these provisions will cover what animal I own at the time that the event occurs of incapacity or death. So I think that's very important to put in there, and the pet trust statute doesn't really provide for that. You also need to be aware of the rule against perpetuities and to make sure that you tie it to a life in being. He suggests tying it to the life of the trustee. I will tell you that these horses that belong to my friend that died, we have 3 horses and 2 dogs we're caring for. One of the dogs is now 17 and a half. The other dog is about 14. And the horses, one of the horses was just 4 years old when my friend died. This horse could live literally another 30 years. And because this all kind of happened on an emergency basis, the funds for these animals will run out. We are not going to be able to invest them to keep that trust funded enough to take care of 3 horses. Horses are expensive. A horse costs at least $500 to $600 a month for minimal care. And that takes us to another topic in a minute, which is how do you determine how much money to put in it? She left a percentage of her estate, and her estate was not small, but it turned out to not be enough. If we had really sat down and calculated it, and we did this the night before she went in for a first surgery. We had created this pet trust organization, but had we done them? No, we had put that off. So that was in 2012. And so I have made arrangements with the guardians of these animals, and I have a guardian agreement I'll show you here in a minute. I've made arrangement with these people that if the funds run out for these horses, the dogs are certainly going to be there until while the funds are still available. But the horses definitely will not be cared for life by these funds. But the people that have the horses now have said, I don't care, I'll keep the horse for life. And I'll take, as long as there's funds available, I'll be happy to accept that. And after those funds have been exhausted, then I'll be happy to keep the horse. And I know they'll take good care of them. So that is something that makes it important to try to accurately calculate what's going on. And for me, in that experience, I think that a life insurance policy that funds the trust for horses is probably the best thing. Because people that have horses, hopefully you can buy a life insurance policy that's pretty reasonable for, $50,000 a horse or something. But that, keep in mind, that's like 12 years at $6,000 a year. So you want to make sure that you're calculating cost accurately. The testamentary trust, a pour-over trust, is certainly one device that you can use. The lifetime expense of that is not huge. Probate of the will required. Well, in New Mexico, we know that's not a big deal. That's not an expensive proposition. And unless you get into the Leona Helmsley thing where you leave way too much money to the animal, and then the heirs are definitely think it is reasonable to try to get that money back for themselves. All right, so when you designate a caregiver and a beneficiary, you do want to, and your client should be able to come up with the caregiver that they prefer at the present time. Now, one of the things that Watch Over Our Friends does, and we've experienced this practically with this trust that I'm telling you about, we have had to move our animals a couple of times. The 17-and-a-half-year-old dog, I had a pretty hard time placing her because she was 12 and a half or so at the time that her owner died, and she was a dog that couldn't be put with other dogs, and she couldn't be put with cats. And one of the devisees of the will moved into the house and then promptly called me and said, "I don't want this dog here. I'm going to have my own dogs. Come get this dog." And I was like, boy, okay, I will. So I found a couple to take this dog, and at first they were reluctant. They went, "Well, we don't know if we want an old dog." Then they called me back and they said, "We're old. We'll take an old dog. We may not survive her." And so they have her, and they adore her and are so good to her. Naming alternates. I think that is where Watch Over Our Friends becomes the most valuable. Most people want to have the control of who their animal goes to first, and they will pick a friend or a relative, a child. But so they have a Great Dane and a horse, and they leave those to their son, and then their son takes a job in New York City. Well, he's probably not going to be able to hang on to that Great Dane and that horse and live in Manhattan. So that is where Watch Over Our Friends can step in and help find an alternate appropriate home, and we monitor that home. We go in on a periodic basis and make sure that the animal is being well cared for and that everything is good. And as an aside, I'm looking for a home for one of the horses right now because some people had her with their other two horses, and a little dog got under the feet of the horse, and now their daughter can't stand to see the side of this horse that killed her little dog. So, yeah, it comes with all food and vet bills paid. So anybody that's a horse lover, just let me know. All right, so, yeah, you never name the caregiver beneficiary is the trustee, as I mentioned, because you do need that check and balance. And an animal care panel, I think that's an excellent idea. Our board monitors that. I have 8 people on my board now, plus myself, and we wouldn't place an animal unless everyone had a chance to give some input into whether or not they thought that was the right place for that animal. All right, and then you nominate the trustee, individual or corporate. Compensation. Again, if you're giving an individual compensation, it's going to create a taxable event for that person that receives the compensation. May not be a big deal, but then again it may, so you want to look at that. And again, name alternates to all of those. Then here's the transferring the animal to the trust. When I write a trust with Watch Over Our Friends, either as the primary or the alternate trustee, we become the owner of the animal. The trustee becomes the owner, and the caregiver is an agent because, again, because of that checks and balance. The Watch Over Our Friends takes responsibility for taking care of the animal immediately. We try to have fosters set up where they can go and get possession of the animal as soon as is necessary, and then deliver it to the caregiver. In the inter vivos, of course, you want the trustee of that to deliver the animal to the pet trustee, who doesn't have to be the same person in an inter vivos trust. You can have a separate trustee from the trustee of the inter vivos, of course. And the same thing with the testamentary. You want that specific bequest to mirror whatever is in their power of attorney, is my advice. And you put the bequest of the animal in the owner's will to the trustee in trust. And at that time, that's when you would fund a testamentary trust with either a bank account, a POD, or a life insurance policy, or specifically designate funds and try to make it where the funds are immediately available. And then the trust provides for the trustee to deliver custody, but not ownership, of the animal to the caregiver and the beneficiary. Here's the other things when you are considering the cost of the animal's care and how much to fund the trust. The type of animal, the life expectancy, the expensive medical costs. Of course, as animals age, they get more expensive to care for. Whether or not you want to give a fee to the trustee or the caregiver, the liability insurance, injuries for pet causes. We do carry insurance for the horses especially. Health insurance for pets, that's one I've been kind of struggling with. I've looked at several pet insurance companies. Do any of you have experience with pet insurance? So, I don't know. Some people, I read reviews on the internet, that pet insurance is great and they reimburse cost immediately. I hate to be too jaded, but insurance companies can be difficult to deal with, and they may not think that they really need to pay for the health insurance that you think you've bought for the pet. And of course, you've got to consider the size of the pet owner's estate. If you've got people with limited resources, probably the powers of attorney and a simple will are going to be what they can afford and what they can do. And then you want to make sure that they do some sort of a designation of beneficiary in a bank account or something to care for the animal's expenses, and or encourage them to try to find some pet insurance or even some life insurance on themselves that is reasonable and within a financial possibility for them. Okay, so yeah, again, there's the Leona Helmsley warning. You don't want to trigger a contest by heirs and beneficiaries by leaving an entire estate to the animals. And here's a repeat of some of the things that we saw before. Keeping a log. The owners should have a log that for each of their animals about what they do. Emergency care. What do they think that they would personally do when it's time to euthanize an animal? That is something that we have learned is necessary to specify in the caregiver agreement. One of the dogs that is in our care, the owners are doing, the caregivers are doing everything they can to keep this dog alive because they're so fond of her, but the cost of caring for that one dog is now approaching the cost of taking care of one of the horses. And so, the board is discussing that. Do we tell them we cannot, this is not an open checkbook. You do not have a blank check to keep this animal alive indefinitely. Plus, what's the animal's quality of life? I think that that's another pretty important consideration. I've heard horror stories of people whose animal had cancer and they had it put in a coma and then kept alive at the vet's office for months. That's not for the animal, that's for the person that hasn't learned to let go. So Anyway, you've got to have some means of accountability. The way that we write our guardianship agreement is that they have to submit receipts to be reimbursed. If they need us to advance care, then we have been able to set up, like at one of the pet stores, there's an account, and at one of the vets, there's an account that they bill it directly to watch over our friends, and we pay that bill directly to the vet and to the pet store for food and other supplies. We also pay for boarding. You know, the idea is for the trust, the pet trust, to pay for whatever the owner would have paid for had they survived. So that's what you're aiming for. And you want it to be flexible. Don't make these carved in stone kind of instructions. You want to make them flexible. You want to make them applicable to the animal that exists in the person's life at the time that the need arises to care for the animal.
Marilyn,
Yes.
As the owner of the animal, I'm thinking the flip side of people that are making the animal live a little too long. People who are anxious to put the animal down
yes.
maybe in advance of. Have you run into that? Is there
Well, that's another one of the reasons you don't want to make the trustee and the beneficiary the same person. You know, we actually had a little dog that we took in whose owner had left his dog to his son, and she was old. She was going blind. She was deaf, but she was not ready to be euthanized. And the son had taken her to a shelter in Las Vegas and said, "Put her down, I don't want her." And that is not what his dad wanted. And so, but it was, you know, the guy had the right to ask that, but fortunately the shelter did not follow those instructions, and we found a home for that dog for the rest of her life. But yes, that is something to consider, is that you don't want the caregiver who is also in charge of the funds to be able to terminate that animal's life too early. When I was very first practicing law in El Paso, Texas, 37 years ago, one of our clients, one of the first people I knew to provide for her animals, this lady had passed away, and she left her two Pekingese, Rusty and Cindy, I'll never forget, to her vet. And we, 6 months later, we called the vet and we said, how's it going? We're ready to give you. Oh, and she had left the money directly to the vet. And we called the vet and we said, how are Rusty and Cindy? He went, "Oh man, I've been meaning to call you. Cindy's in the freezer. What should I do with her?" And Cindy, I hope, had died a natural death. I don't know. But yeah, we had to decide on the spot if Cindy was to be buried or cremated or put out with the trash. So you want to make those you want your client to make those kind of decisions too. What happens to the animal's remains. And what happens to the remainder of the trust that may exist at the time the last of the animals covered by the trust passes away. Does it go back into the will to be distributed to the devisees as the will instructs? Does it go to a charity? Does it go to another animal group? Does it go to take care of another animal for someone that can't afford it? There's about as many ways as you can think of to help your client through that decision. So here are the distribution methods. Fixed sum, $600 a month to care for a horse, and that's got to be used for food and vet care and shoeing and teeth and all of the things that horses have to have done to them. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't account for a change in circumstances, like the aging of the animal or an accident or anything like that. And then a fixed sum to the trustee, from the trustee to the caregiver is what I recommend. A fixed sum from the trustee to the caregiver with the discretion to pay additional expenses with sufficient documentation, with receipts for, the animal did have emergency care, or the animal had, an accident and actually could live a long time with one of those carts for their back legs. I guess you've all seen that. I actually have a picture of a cat here that was done for. And then there's also you just pay for reimbursement of expenses only, and the caregiver is responsible for those. Then the quality of care, you want to make sure that distributions allow for quality of care, and then decrease amount available. I personally can't conceive of that, but maybe that would be it if you go from an animal that is large, and maybe as they get older, they don't need as much food. I don't know. And you do need to limit the duration of the trust. You need to look at the rule against perpetuities, which may have been repealed in this bill that repealed 45-907. I haven't looked at that. I just found out this weekend that the bill had been repealed. As I told you, when we set this seminar up, I didn't even know there were plans afoot to repeal this particular bill. But do any of you know Jack Burton? He's an estate planning, okay. I think he was the author of the bill and decided that having 45-907 and 46A-4408 was duplicative. We only needed the shorter statute. All right, here's where we're talking about the remainder beneficiary. Who do you want to give it to? And do not name the caregiver, as it gives the caregiver lack of incentive to keep the animal alive, which was Judy's question. And this is one I had not thought of, but this is an excellent idea. You need to identify the animal that's subject to the trust to prevent fraud. Professor Beyer had a situation, or knew of a situation, where this woman was given care of a cat, and, like the cat's like 27 years old, so it wasn't the same cat. So you want to either microchip or have their DNA done, which is only about $65. The owner needs to make sure that they have properly identified the animal for the trust. And here is what one of the things that Watch Over Our Friends does. We do monitor. We inspect the animal's home, unannounced visits, make sure that the care is appropriate. And I have people all over the country, well, not all over. I have a board member in Colorado. I have 2 board members in Colorado, 2 in Texas, 1 in Arizona, and several here in New Mexico. And so we are monitoring in all of those places. And then you want the owner to give you instructions when you write up the trust for the final disposition of the pet. Where do they want them? All right, the statutory pet trust. That's what 46A-4408 is. It's just, I leave $1,000 in trust. It does say, someone can enforce. It says the money must be used for the purpose intended. And it says that the trust ends when the animals die. And it directs that there should be a means of distribution of remaining money. But that's it. That's all it says in it. It doesn't say anything about level of care or emergency care or temporary or permanent care, any of the things that you need to consider when you're writing these. Other planning options, outright gift of the animal and money. That's like I was talking about. Mom leaves the Great Dane and the horse to their son, and he has the money, but he moves to New York. What happens then? Who's going to find the homes for those animals? And is the person going to care a lot about what happens to them? A transfer to a life care center. There's an organization in I think it's in Florida, that's called the Phoenix, that takes care of exotic birds, which of course live such a long time. People that have exotic birds really do need to set up a trust. You've got parrots that live to be 125 years old. I had a cockatiel that lived to be 25. And again, may require a significant endowment. I have a new client that had left she has 5 or 6 macaws and parrots, and she had left them to, she was planning to leave them directly to a exotic bird sanctuary in Florida, but she was just going to leave them the money outright, and then she found out that they weren't even planning to use that money to take care of her birds. They were just going to put it into their endowment, and they had no responsibility in the way she had written up her original documents to take her birds in. So we're changing that. The other thing, I don't know if you all are aware of the fact that several of the vet schools now, Texas A&M, I know for sure, and UC Davis in California, they have these life care centers. And let me go back to that one. But it requires substantial endowments. It is not for people who are just trying to take care of their little dog or cat that survives them. For a dog to be taken care of at the A&M Center, and what they have is they've built a house for dogs and a house for cats. And the vet students live in those houses and care for the animals, but it's a turnover. So the animal doesn't have an owner or a regular life. They have people coming in and out of their lives. That'll work for some animals, but not all. Some animals, you know, really need to bond with one person. And to put a dog in that facility, when I last checked about 2 years ago, required a $60,000 endowment, regardless of the animal's age and regardless of how long it lived. And no remainder beneficiary was able to be named. The money went to Texas A&M Vet School. For a horse, it was $120,000. So those are available. UC Davis, I don't know what their fees are, but I suspect that many of the vet schools are now jumping on this bandwagon and doing this. Are any of you familiar with Best Friends Animal Sanctuary in Utah, Kanab? Yeah, they have 1,500 animals on site at all times, and they do adopt out. Very, very difficult to get an animal in there. I'm presently working with them trying to see if they will be the backup for Wolf, that if they will be willing to be our, to step in to keep our organization running if I should die, if my board members should not want to keep it running or whatever. So there's also a group here in Albuquerque, Animal Humane. Are you all familiar with Animal Humane? They are a nonprofit here that apparently takes no government funds. They're not the shelter. They're a separate nonprofit, aren't they? Is that correct? Yeah. And I think they do an excellent job. So, again, we are putting alternates to ourselves into our documents. So the history of estate planning. England favored it. You've all seen Pride and Prejudice where they have 1 million dogs running around all the time and the family enjoying them. The United States, really, the animal law for the United States, if any of you have been involved in very many animal law cases, it does not favor care of animals. If a vet makes a mistake and your animal dies, the only thing you can recover is basically what you paid for that pet. You cannot recover any kind of emotional damage, which for many people that would be huge. Here are the problems that we're trying to solve now with traditional trust and with other emergency care. The rule against perpetuities, the measuring life has to be a human, not an animal. The which one? The rule against perpetuities? Okay, thanks, Helga. Yeah. So no more as of July 1st.
Well, I'm only skimming, but I think that's what it's saying.
All right.
Yeah.
You can look this up, the legislative site. It's SB 155. And I actually have a printout of it if someone wants to read through the whole thing. But okay, so the honorary trust, now that is different than our statutory trust. No human beneficiary capable of enforcing the trust. A human can enforce a statutory trust under the way that the New Mexico statute is written, which I think is good. And like I said, the statute says the court may appoint or may appoint or allow another person to enforce the trust, an interested person. So you probably do want to have, like we could do that as part of our monitoring. If we find out that an animal is not being properly cared for, our caregiver agreement says we can come in and take that animal without any discussion. This is the presentation that I have made to various animal groups. This is designed for clients more than attorneys. So, here's the question. If I'm not able to care for them or I'm no longer around, what are your plans? Do you have anything in writing? Isn't telling your family enough? You know, in my opinion, it's not. Your family, their circumstances may make it impossible for them. If you're an animal lover, chances are your family has lots of animals too. And I have a friend who has 5 or 6 dogs, and she said, "Oh, my daughter will take them." I said, "Your daughter has 5 or 6 dogs. What are you talking about?" So, and people always worry, isn't going to a lawyer too expensive? So the honorarium trust, and of course now our honorarium trust is repealed, so I need to change this one. And a pet trust needs a trustee, and that's where we come in, required by law to follow these directions. And we are a 501c3, IRS recognized, and in good standing with the Secretary of State. And I will work with any of you anytime you need. I'm so happy to share my forms and my experience and whatever you need. So, so you make the decision to leave funds for your pets, and you can choose watch over our friends as the trustee. And I'm saying we when I'm talking to a client. So here's what we try to explain to people. They have a hard time grasping this. You know, they don't know anything about legal terms. Many people have never heard the word trustee. Many people have never heard the word personal representative. They have no idea that a will has to be probated. You know, this is why so few people really have wills. It's a challenging area and a lot of superstition around it. So this is one of the dogs that one of our board members rescued from the reservation over in Four Corners. And we monitor the homes for these animals. So why monitor? So here's my Great Dane Quarter Horse example. And you have named your best friend, but then your best friend is diagnosed with cancer, and you know that those animals are not going to be with her for life. So, all right. So here's the checklist. Again, the person needs to give you this information, and they need to be made aware that they need to keep this information up to date. And the animal's life expectancy. Birds, horses, reptiles, you know, people who, I don't know if anybody's allowed to keep a turtle these days. You know, turtles are some of them being endangered. I think even desert box turtles are now considered endangered. The standard of living you wish to provide for. Do you want your pet trust to continue to pay for grooming for your animal? Or was that just kind of something that you did because you could afford it, but you can't figure out how to include enough money in the trust to continue grooming? And you're going to ask that caregiver under the caregiver agreement to bathe the dog regularly. And the need for potential expensive medical treatment as the animal ages. The emergency care funds, and how do you set up those instructions and where do you put them? The client needs to be aware of all of that. Do you want to ask the caregiver if they need to be paid to take care of this animal? My thought is, if you are providing someone with an